Hey guys, today we're going to talk about the LFO, and no, I'm not talking about a band, though I am sexy and I do know it. The LFO is the low frequency oscillator. What that means is it's a oscillator that normally, oscillates or vibrates at a range below what we can normally hear, which would be under 20 hertz or 20 times a second. And you would wonder, like, well, why would you put something on a synthesizer, a musical instrument, that you can't hear? What's the point of that? Well, let's back up to when we were talking about the waveforms before. I have right here just a clean square wave. Not really doing anything special. But I may have pointed out before that we can play with the shape of that on this. And you do get, with the square wave, like a really cool kind of reverberation as you mess with that. It's got almost like a, like a phaser kind of a sound to it. And it's cool, but, you know, it makes it kind of hard to play or do anything else when I'm using one hand always to just play with this one knob. How am I supposed to make these cool filter sweeps if I'm constantly doing this? And that's what the LFO is for. It's a very common source of modulation. It's present on almost like every single synth. Again, there's so many different kinds and varieties of stuff out there, especially now with like Eurorack and modular stuff being really popular, that, you know, not every synthesizer is going to have access to a LFO, but I would say almost every single one would. It's very common, so it's worth knowing what they are and what they can do for you. What we can do is just basically can automate this little movement here for us. The LFO has two properties, rate and interval. If you want to think of it like a rubber band, would probably help. Whereas rate is how fast you're stretching the rubber band out and then letting it go back. And interval is how long the rubber band is, just how far you can stretch it before it hits and then comes back. So if we have a very low rate but a very long interval, we're going to get a sound that's very slowly moving between two very broad points. Or if we have a very small interval and a very high rate, we're going to get a sound that just goes back and forth very quickly between two very close points. I can demonstrate. Let's get like, we'll do like a Wile E. Coyote kind of sound here, where if we take, now we'll put this on pitch, I'll make the interval huge and the rate very, very slow. We'll get this sort of falling off a cliff sound. Where we have the interval is huge, but the rate's very, very slow. I'm not sure how long it's going to take before we even bounce back. Now I'm kind of curious, actually. Anywhere? How low can we go? This is kind of absurd, but hey. Like I said before, like, you have a lot of freedom to make a lot of really dumb things. Oh, here we go. Fun. But no, that's not what we're talking about doing. What we're talking about is the square wave and playing with that shape. What we're actually doing here, we'll make the interval small and we'll up the rate. What we're actually doing, we're creating an extended waveform that you'll see a lot called pulse width modulation. It's a kind of square wave that you'll see often as like a fourth option on your oscillators. All it is a square wave that has some modulation source that's just doing this. It's changing the rate, or the, well, not the rate, but the shape of the pulse length. Or width, I guess, you know. And it's neat because it almost sounds like I have a sub oscillator or a second oscillator in here when you do it like that. Starts to get a little nuts. Ooh, this clicking isn't very good. It's a cool bass sound that it can give us, but that's just like one example of what that can do. You could also use this, at least on this synthesizer, to also, we could be affecting the filter. I could change this to the cutoff, so it'll give us sort of like an automatic little bit of a wub to it. Different LFOs on different synthesizers have different patchable sources, or not sources, but targets for what you want them to affect. This is commonly why you like on some of those like stereotypical pictures of synthesizers, you'll see cables running all over the place, and that's because they're using sources like an LFO to modulate a destination. In this case, our source is the LFO, and our destination is the shape of the square wave. But that's incredibly common, and it's again one of the creative and like fun parts of synthesis. We do have some special modulation here just for VCO2, but I actually don't want to go into that just yet. I wanted to kind of just talk about the LFO in this one, and maybe in the next video or two we'll get around to some of the potentials of this. I may skip this entirely because it's kind of particular to this synthesizer what this does, though ring mods and stuff are kind of typical outside of this. You may not see this on every synthesizer, so it might be worth skipping. I'll probably actually talk about delay next, even though that's also not something you'll see on every synthesizer is built-in delay. It's actually very common, and as far as After Effects go, it gets a lot of use in electronic music, and so for that reason I think delay might actually be a little more important than what we can do with this VCO2 modulation. So yeah, very brief, little LFO, little pulse width modulation, but that's what the LFO is for, what it can do, and kind of a brief introduction to modulation.